This is Ron Peters.
I'm John Nugent.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We have returned recently from the sunny climes of San Diego and come back to snow and disaster forecasting.
I like the snow. I love
fine.
the warmth of Southern California, but I'll take the snow too.
Yeah, it's fine. It's just my body wasn't ready for it. And I've had a head cold for like a week, so it's not helping.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
But we're back, and we thought we'd give you a big update for all the things we encountered in San Diego, mostly from the conference. Anyone like to go first?
Well, I think one of the things that stood out to me is like you go there looking to hear something that's going to be like a paradigm shift. Like you want to hear the latest scholarship. And so you're hoping to hear a paper that's going to really challenge the way you think on some topic and kind of send you off in a really cool new direction. And I heard lots of little good things here and there, but I didn't hear something that was like the massive paradigm shift that we've gotten at times in the past. Like it doesn't seem to be, and that's not where scholarship is right now. And so it was good because you're still staying up to date on what people are talking about, and you want to make sure that you are. But there hasn't been like that big thing in quite a while. I don't know. Do you agree, disagree?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree. I feel like just biblical scholarship feels kind of stagnant right now.
Yeah, we're kind of in a lull.
There's not a lot of exciting research. There's plenty of research.
Right, yeah.
But it's not terribly exciting because I remember in the 2000s and so forth, I mean, for me in the Old Testament, you have high-low chronology, you had the development of Israelite religion with all these comparative studies. There's so much coming out and archaeological finds. It just seems like I go into these papers and someone has focused on some minutia that's fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't do much for me in my understanding of the Old Testament or of the Bible as a whole. That specific passage maybe, but even then it's not doing a lot of work for me. And again, I'm in more of a confessional type school where I care a lot more about application and the rest than some of them, but still I get frustrated with just the lack of anything super engaging.
Yeah. Well, and I think in New Testament studies, like the last really big change was like the new perspective on Paul.
Yeah.
That was really transformative. And it really did. It wasn't just biblical studies, but it was challenging notions of theology, what it means to be the people of God. And it was really growing out of our understanding of Second Temple Judaism. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of really great advancements have been made in the last, 40, 50 years in that regard. And I think that now we're kind of over the hump on it. Like for a while, people were even freaking out about it. It's like, oh my gosh, what are these people saying? But the more scholars dug into it, they're more like, no, this is actually a really good way of thinking about Second Temple Judaism and how Paul was responding to it. And so now what was this freaky thing out there is becoming more and more the norm. And that was like the last big sort of seismic shift we saw in New Testament studies. And we haven't seen anything like that. And it's made its way into gospel studies and other things as well, because we're reading even the Gospels in light of our better understanding of Second Temple Judaism. And so even beyond that, like it's not the news perspective, but it's just like we've learned so much in the last half century. And I guess there aren't any like really big revelations coming out that are going to have that kind of impact on our studies.
Yeah. Agree.
Yeah. I mean, and there were some minor little things that were good. I went to a couple pedagogy sessions and to a couple, how to teach Hebrew Bible sessions. And there are some little things, like you said, I can take, but nothing like, oh, I've been doing it wrong my whole life. Like,
right, yeah.
I didn't get any of that.
Yeah, the highlight of mine from a paper's presentation standpoint was the presidential address, which I don't think either of you guys made. Mm-hmm. But basically, Tamara Cohen-Eskenazi, I hope I'm saying that right. But yeah, she just did an excellent job of talking about the state of biblical studies. And she didn't have that epiphany, here's the new breakthrough for everyone, but she kind of doubled down on the basics, like committing to the work of the craft and paying attention to the context and the meaning. And she even did some pushback, because I think if there is a wave or a trend in biblical studies and in theological studies, it's, I guess what you would say, minority hermeneutic, minority perspectives. What do female readers of Scripture have to say? What do black readers of Scripture have to say? What do queer theologians have to say? Right? Just take a minority group who's been anything but a white male.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's time for their voices to be heard and elevated. It's kind of like an affirmative action going on within
Right.
biblical studies, which is why for us it's kind of a hard time to
Be in
to
scholarship.
feel like what we have to say is wanted right now
Yeah.
at that level. And I understand it as a corrective,
Sure.
and I appreciate what they're trying to do. But if those fields of study, are not what your passion is, right, then it's like, well, no one else is talking.
Mhm.
And so, and there was some, pushback, I think, at the presidential address, just kind of saying, hey, like, let's free up the next generation of scholars to like do work and not have to like satisfy the kind of criteria for acceptability of the previous generation. And especially like, I thought there was some pushback on holding the next generation of scholars hostage to the pet peeves and the kind of language battles and preferences of the previous generation, kind of the policing of language. There was some encouragement to like, let off the next generation, let them speak in their own voice and find their way. So I found it a very encouraging and unifying message. That was probably the highlight of my time there.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of the transition between like sort of a very modern worldview of understanding the Bible to the postmodern, and there was that kind of clashing and like, no, like we can view the Bible differently, and let's allow that to happen instead of you must view it in a certain way. Of course, going on the opposite end of the spectrum, but nonetheless. Yeah.
Well, I think you and I, Sam, both, we talked to publishers about some book projects we have in mind. And I know my conversation went very well. Probably won't be done for another couple of weeks just because we've got work here at the college to finish up. But I'm looking forward to getting a proposal out there. And if they get it approved, then I'm already planning on working on a book next year. But it'd be sure nice to have a good relationship with a publisher that I know exactly where to send the manuscript when I'm done.
Yeah, same. It was very, very helpful conversation, and they seem excited about what I want to work on, which is always nice.
It is nice. Instead of like, yeah, that's a big snore. Go find somebody else.
There's no audience
Yeah.
for that. Like, oh,
Exactly.
Yeah, I felt blessed. I mean, I had 2 books come out last year, and both of them were at the conference, and both of them were featured. So,
Nice.
like at Whiffenstock, they had a virtual display, a virtual exhibit that was kind of alongside their physical exhibit, and they had 10 books highlighted, and my Fourfold Office of Christ was highlighted, so I appreciated that. And then at Fortress Press, my Priestly Presence book, it was there in a prominent place, and they had a kind of a poster of it against the board, the kind of backboard display of it. So I felt good that, my books were given a chance to be seen by scholars.
Yep.
So, but no, I didn't have any new projects to talk with anyone about.
you have plenty of projects.
I did talk to a publisher about your projects, but
which I appreciate.
Yeah, and you kind of smoothed over what was a very embarrassing encounter I had with the publisher the first time. I'm amazing.
Classic Ron.
It was horrific. It was all my fault. He was being a fantastic guy, and I was kind of a jerk to him. Unintentionally, it was totally by accident, but nevertheless, I can't believe he had a conversation with me because I was
All right.
unintentionally rude to him.
all right, so we got to talk about this because now people are wondering what did
Yeah,
Ron do.
right.
So, the publisher at
Abington.
not Abington, ACU Press,
Yeah,
Abilene.
Jason Fikes, right?
yeah.
Yeah, Abilene Christian University. Anyway, he ran into us. Like, we had conversations on the plane about, you got to talk to Jason Fikes. Like, he's a guy who would be great to work with, publish. And we ran into him, and we kind of, he ran into the 4 of us, and we were like, hey, these guys got some things going on. And you talked a little bit, and it was kind of in passing, but like a quick hello. And then later on, Ron, you can explain what happened.
Yeah, I like, you got to imagine this giant hall with all these publishers and everything, and I'm walking through there looking at books, and he walks up to me and he starts talking to me, and it was so bad for 2 reasons. Number one, I was totally focused on something else, and so he like tried to interrupt my thoughts, and so I'm like trying to like recalibrate and have a conversation with him, and then I forgot that I met him. Like he's right, like yeah, we met yesterday. I was like, we did. Because my mind did
Like,
not
who are you?
Yeah, basically that was what it was. My mind did not write
goodness.
a memory file for that particular encounter. And so like I'm trying to talk to him, but my brain is just not cooperating. And it was so awkward. And again, like I said, it was totally my fault. He was being a really great guy. And it was horrible. It was the most embarrassing train wreck I've ever been a part of. And so
Wait, you're on this podcast.
Even
Sorry.
worse than anything that's happened here.
So I ran into him a little bit later,
Yeah.
and I said, "So I heard you had an encounter with Ron." He's like, "Oh yeah." I'm like,
Oh my gosh.
Anyway.
It was so bad. But when we got together,
I
next
said
time,
he's planning on coming and seeing you, and yeah, he was very receptive to what you were talking about.
and we had a great conversation the second time, and I apologized over and over again. I said, "Please, please,
As you
please
should.
forgive me." Yeah, rightfully so. So I can laugh about it now, but it was bad.
Anyway, that's our little few highlights from
Yes.
from SBL, and we perhaps some of the biggest highlights were like meeting with people and
Yep.
connecting with our Christian church folk and connecting with people and conversations about the grad program and
And former students, we saw Jeremy and Sarah. So
you know, and we ran into some listeners to the podcast who recognized us. So that was kind of cool.
a lot of good stuff happening.
All right. Well, we're back to the book of Micah. And just to kind of give some context of where we're going to start in chapter 4, verse 6. And I just want to locate this in the context of the book. The book of Micah is divided roughly into 3 sections: message 1, message 2, message 3. Each message has oracles of doom followed by oracles of salvation. And so in previous episodes, we completed message 1, we completed message 2, the oracle of doom, and we started into the oracle of salvation, which kind of started in chapter 4, verse 1. So we're going to pick up in verse 6, which is part of the oracles of salvation. And this is the biggest, longest extended section in terms of oracles conveying future hope. So, Sam, you want to lead us out?
We'll read 6 through 5:1. On that day, says the Lord, I will assemble the lame, and I will gather those who have been driven away and those whom I have afflicted. The lame I will make the remnant, and those who are cast off a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion, now and forevermore. And you, O tower of the flock, hill of daughter Zion, to you it shall come, the former dominion shall come, the sovereignty of daughter Jerusalem. Now why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished? Pangs have seized you like a woman in labor? Writhe and groan, O daughter Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go forth from the city and camp in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hands of your enemies. Now many nations are assembled against you, saying, Let her be profaned. Let our eyes gaze upon Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan, that he has gathered them as sheaves on the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter Zion, for I will make your horn iron and your hoofs bronze. You shall beat in pieces many peoples, and shall devote their gain to the Lord, their wealth to the Lord of the whole earth. Now you are walled around like a wall. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the ruler of Israel upon the cheek. So there's a lot of talk about Zion, which, just a reminder, is Jerusalem, specifically. It's the capital city, but also kind of like God's dwelling place for them. And there's a lot of talk. It's kind of it is comfort, but it's also a little bit of judgment type in there as well.
Yeah.
Because he talks about it begins by talking about them as the underdog, right? They've been driven away, the lame, right? The symbol of a person who's been cast out, who's kind of a drag of society. God's going to bring that person back, and that's who he's going to use to rebuild his people. As it moves through, it just talks about how things look bad now, and they are, but that's not the last word. And eventually, not only will the nation be restored, but also the nations that have oppressed you will they will be shut down as well.
Yeah, I mean, what really stands out to me is how it says you're going to Babylon. It's not, everything's going to be all right, I'm going to take care of you. It's like, no, you're going into exile. And so you could look at that as a little bit of the negative part of it, but it's in that context that God is promising restoration and giving them sort of hope in a future. And so it's kind of a little bit of a mixed bag there. It's like you got to deal with the fact that there are consequences for your actions, and you can't get away from that. But those consequences aren't the end of the story. So it gives them a little bit of a dark frame, but still a very positive look at the future.
It is significant that when it's talking about Zion and it talks about exile, it's talking about Babylon.
Right.
Because up until this point, most of the oracles have been about the northern kingdom. And their exile is not to Babylon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their enemy is Assyria,
Mm-hmm.
and they are scattered. There is a scattering of the northern kingdom, but it's not so focused on scattering to Babylon, the way the southern kingdom was exiled specifically to the heart of Babylon. So what do you make of that in terms of the book, its structure, and what's going on here?
Well, there's a couple options. Thanks, John. On the one hand, we talked about this a couple episodes ago, but the makeup of this book, it could either be updating, like an oracle that was written that is updated later, that makes more sense, because to tell a later audience like, oh, you're going to go in exile to Assyria, like, no, it's actually Babylon. That's the nation. So you have that, or it could be a later oracle that's been inserted in. Sort of like it's made sense in the context here. Like, yeah, like what Malachi, you got me.
I know it's all my fault. I apologize.
What Micah was talking about previously now has even like a new, fuller sense in the context of Babylon coming and all. And so we're gonna, write an oracle in that vein and put it in. Like both are possibilities, because it's hard for me to see Micah talking about Babylon.
Right.
It was just they were not the world power. I'm not saying they weren't a power, but I mean it was all Assyria all the time. And so to talk about exile in the sense of with Babylon would be a prophetic in the future telling sense. And I don't know that that's what Micah was doing. And so I think an alternative explanation, either an updating or a later insertion, makes more sense.
Just for the sake of argument, let's just say it is prophetic. Like,
okay.
Micah is speaking from God and talking about Babylon. And the people are like, why are you talking about Babylon? Babylon's nobody. Assyria is in charge. Would that, let's say he did do it. Would that cause people to not only maybe be in shock, but maybe even to disregard it? He's like, you're talking about the wrong thing, buddy. It's like he's ahead of the curve, but nobody else is. And so would they have ignored it until things started falling into place and like, oh, so this is what he was talking about. He saw something coming that we didn't. Like I said, I'm just trying to say for the sake of argument.
Sure. I think that's possible. To be honest, this is probably going to be a terrible comparison, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. It reminds me more of the movies Red Dawn.
Yeah.
The first one, who was the enemy?
Russia.
During the Cold War, the 80s, made perfect sense.
Right.
Of course, right now it would still make some sense.
Yeah, but for a long time it didn't.
Right, it would not have made sense. They were not so they remade it, and who was the new enemy?
Well, it was going to be China, but then they changed it to North Korea
Right.
because they were getting in trouble with the Chinese audience.
Right, and so it's like, oh, okay, I see. So
yeah,
that for me is a better explanation than the future telling thing that no one would have had any real handle to hold on to.
Yeah. No, it's a good explanation. I appreciate that.
And that which doesn't make it not prophecy.
Oh, sure.
Right, yeah.
I mean, first of all, if it's talking about, if this is addressing Judah, who is going through the same things a couple of centuries later, right? Because, Judah's experience of the downfall of Zion, I mean, that was prophesied by Israelite prophets in the 6th century, right? And Micah lived and prophesied during the 8th century when Assyria was the foe. So if this was updated in the 6th century to address the new foe, Babylon, it's still prophetic in the 8th century that Babylon is going to come and take over the kingdom, because there are people who thought Babylon wasn't going to take over because God protects Jerusalem, right? Like when God protected Jerusalem against Sennacherib's invasion, people developed a theology of Jerusalem is impenetrable. So if this was updated in a later generation to say what happened to the northern kingdom from Assyria and Jerusalem was protected from, well, it's going to happen down here and God's not going to protect her. So, it could have been prophetic from a 2 centuries later perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you don't believe in predictive prophecy, right? It's just the theory is that this could be an updated version of the book to apply to a later situation, which is equally prophetic.
Yeah. I mean, I could easily see Micah saying, you see what's happening to the northern kingdom, right? Y'all see that, right? Assyria's coming down. They're taking city after city, and depending on when this was written, like Samaria may or may not have fallen yet. It would be easy for me to see him saying, you see what's happening there, right? What makes you think that we're not next? And so whether it's Assyria or it's Babylon, that makes perfect sense to me. And then oh yeah, he got the circumstances right, but the specific nation. I mean, who knows if it were an update what he actually wrote? He may have not even included a nation. He may have said like, we're going to go off to exile because we're bad people, right? But then God's going to bring us back, right? And so, I mean, for me, it's focusing on the point of the message, and a lot of times we get bogged down in details, and I think that misses the point.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Interesting stuff when you get into the Old Testament history, and
Yeah.
and so some people, when they hear about a book has been updated or whatever, it's kind of like there are two types of scholars out there: those who believe that predictive prophecy is possible, so that everything is always a prediction, right? And then there are others who don't believe in predictive prophecy, so everything that was ever predicted was written after the fact, right? But there's actually a third middle way. There are people who do believe in predictive prophecy, only their knowledge of the text is sometimes texts, especially ancient texts, have gone under different editions and updatings. And so it has nothing to do with a commitment to prophecy or not, like predictive. It just has to do with what does the evidence say about the history of the composition of this text, which yields different theories, right? So, I think either one can preserve the predictive nature of what the prophet is doing, whether in the 8th century or the 6th century. But there's nothing, the thing that stands out about this chapter, and it goes back to, the beginning of the chapter, it's a Zion-focused chapter.
Yeah.
Where the first several chapters really focused on Jacob, Israel, northern kingdom, Samaria. This is all about Jerusalem. And perhaps why there's so much hope is that, especially from an 8th century vantage point, Jerusalem had a lot more hope than the northern kingdom.
Yeah.
And that itself is wildly predictive, right? Like the northern kingdom was dissolved and never really reconstituted after what Assyria did. The southern kingdom was devastated, and they rebuilt. There was a remnant. There was a restart. And, Jesus comes as a part of that rebuilding to kind of finalize what had begun or to take it to a whole new level. And so, but the hope is still for a gathering. I think that's really important.
Correct.
In the first few verses, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away, those whom I have afflicted. So the long expectation of God's people is the gathering back of Jews who were scattered from the land. And the hope is for the gathering of, Zion's scattered ones, but also, and we're going to see this in other passages, the gathering of the scattered.
Scabbard.
Scabbard.
The scattered northern Israelites, and that they might be united with the all the scattered Israelites, north and south, will be brought together in the restored people of God. And that's very much part of the hope that Jesus came to fulfill.
Yeah. And I will say that I'm with you on all that. It's interesting, though, in 11, it turns a little dark in the sense of, and all these nations that have done all these things against you, they're going to get theirs too. And they're the ones who said, I can't wait to see the downfall of Zion. God says, so you've gathered around to see that, but what you don't know is you've gathered around for destruction. Mm-hmm. And you're here watching, but you're standing in a threshing floor, and you're going to be threshed right there in front of everyone. And in fact, it's going to happen. It seems like through Zion. He says, I'm going to make your horn iron, which horn, is the symbol of strength and power, and the hooves bronze. And in that day and age, so wheat is threshed with humans, but also animals by trampling on it, right?
Yeah.
And so he's like using this kind of mixed metaphor imagery to basically say, and all you other nations who are so happy to see the downfall of the southern kingdom, you just wait because you're going to get trampled like wheat.
And so they've gathered on the observation deck to watch
Right.
Zion fall down, and they don't realize they've all been gathered into one place to be eliminated.
Yeah.
But this is one of few passages, I think, well, maybe comparatively few, where Zion is the agent of the destruction.
Yeah.
In many prophecies, and I think Ezekiel really stands out, there's lots of oracles about the judgment of the nations. It's something God's going to do, right? And the Israelites, almost like with the conquest, they can kind of come in and, clean up the mess and, reestablish a new order. But God does the defeating. Here, Zion seems to play a role, and that could explain passages like this, are maybe the kinds that the zealots latched onto,
Oh, yeah.
where
Yeah.
I
Oh,
get to
sure.
be the instrument of God bringing judgment to the peoples. And that's one of the things Jesus had to set the record straight on. Yes, God will, but that's not going to be the church's mission, right? To be the agents, right? The kingdom people are not the agents of destruction of the nations. God's still going to do that. And that fulfills far more of these prophecies that focus on God as the agent, just like with the conquest. But what do you make of the fact that there are a few passages like this where God's people seem to be in the midst of it, but in its fulfillment, right? I mean, God's people did not bring judgment upon Babylon. And this is part of the prophecy of the middle portion of Isaiah, is that God's judgment is upon Babylon, but the Israelites don't have any role in executing that judgment. They rather are God's witnesses, that God called the fact that he was going to destroy the Babylonians, and God did bring them down using pirates. Oh, my goodness. Cyrus of Persia, right?
Did he say Pirates of Persia? Oh my gosh, I'm so happy right
I was
now.
going there.
That's the new
you
movie.
got me
Pirates
thinking
of
about
Persia.
scabbards.
Exactly. The Pirates of Persia, they're scabbards.
Like, what have you been thinking about today? There's something in your mind that's
I don't know. I've been thinking about Malachi.
way to deflect it from yourself onto me.
You're
That was
welcome.
great.
But you know what I'm saying? Isaiah has to make clear that your role is not to bring the judgment on Babylon. You're the witnesses to God's sovereignty over history and how he does it and how he uses Persia as this. And he prophesies that Cyrus is going to be the one, right? And then Israel is the one who heard the prophecy. They saw it. They can confirm it. But here, they're the agents. So how do we deal with they're the agent, but in history, they weren't really the agent? And Jesus doesn't come in to correct that and make us the agents after
Right.
all.
Yeah, agency, it's an interesting thing. I wonder, because there are not many like this, you're right, that mostly it's God's going to do this, or God's going to use another nation to do it. Either way, it's God.
Yeah.
And God's still doing this. Like, God's the one who's going to make their horn iron and their hooves bronze. But then it says, and you'll beat them into pieces. I don't know that I have a good answer. On the one hand, I think there's a vicarious nature to it. Like when we watch sports, we say, we're winning. Are we winning? Are we playing? And I'm like, no,
Right.
we're not. But our team is.
Okay.
And
yeah.
and I don't know if that's what's going on, but that's, I think, one way of possibly reading it, just understanding, like, I mean, he's trying to give these people who have been beaten down, who've been threshed themselves, to give them a little bit of hope. And so I'm sure it would have been nice to say, oh, finally, we're actually going to win. Like, we've been losers our whole life. We get beat down all the time. We never win a game. And so now we're going to get to participate in a victory. And I don't know, for me, it's the hope more than the agency that I think is the focus.
I was thinking the same thing. I think you and I kind of fell in that same place there, that God's trying to give them a vision of their own future and a future of overcoming. You know, it's like if you're a Detroit Lions fan this year, it feels so
Amen.
good to have a team that's on a 10-game winning streak. It's like we've never seen this in our whole lives. And I love that analogy. It's like we're winning, even though I have no connection. But it's that idea that we're on the winning side. And for people who are being beaten down, you know, Sam, you said it, being threshed, for God to say, eventually you're going to be on the winning side. You know, it makes me think of Revelation, you know, written to Christians who are suffering or facing the distinct possibility of immense suffering, to say, yes, you're going to suffer for a while, but understand sooner or later the tables will be turned and you will be the victors. And it just gives hope to the residents of Jerusalem that someday that's going to be your experience as well.
Yeah. Revelation does kind of make it interesting
Yeah.
because the martyrs are the victorious ones.
Yeah.
But their victory, kind of like the victory of the Lamb, like the victory is won by the Lion of Judah. But what does he look like? A slain lamb.
Right.
It's
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
through his suffering and martyrdom
Yep.
that God established his victory over the powers of the world and the Roman Empire. And so, you know, there is a sense in which, you know, God's people, when this is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus and in the kingdom, you know, we are the champions, but it's not through military conquest. You know, we win over the nations through our suffering and our witness to the kingdom.
Yeah.
Right. The way Jesus won over the kingdoms of the world.
Right.
So that's interesting. And also I would say it doesn't say, and the Israelites will swoop in. And it says we're in the metaphor of Zion.
Right.
And it's not naming the Israelite individuals. And Zion is depicted as triumphing over the nations. And maybe this is the fact that the kingdom of God in the end will still be standing in the place where nations used to hold sway over Zion and other nations. And so maybe it's that supplanting them, right? Occupying, they kind of are under Zion's feet as Zion and God's kingdom, which Zion represents, replaces them. And so there's a sense in which there is a underfoot placing that happens metaphorically as God's kingdom replaces the kingdoms of this world. So maybe make less individualize it is another way of going about it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the language even reminds me a little bit of the Exodus, the whole, you shall devote their gain to the Lord and the wealth of the Lord to the whole earth. Like this idea of when the Israelites left, the Hebrews left, they took a bunch of the wealth of the Egyptians with them, and it was all devoted to God to create a tabernacle, right? And there's the interesting, perhaps, parallels there between those stories. And again, God was the one doing all that. They were just along for the ride. One more point before we move on. Chapter 5, verse 1. It turns. It says now. I wish it would almost be translated, but for now.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You are walled around with a wall. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the ruler of Israel upon the cheek. Because he just laid out, the end of the story is this great restoration of Zion. But for now, I know there's a whole army surrounding you, and they're beating down your leaders and so forth. And this is, he envisions a siege, right? Which is what this is. And it probably has ties to the Assyrian siege during the reign of Hezekiah and all that business. Or it could have been the siege around Samaria as well, quite frankly. But this idea of, but for now, this is what you're dealing with. And I understand that, but there's hope in the future. And so, there's great historical things like Sennacherib's prism and this idea of Sennacherib talks about it one way, the Bible talks about it another way. In the prism, they surrounded him like a bird in a cage, and it's all over. And then we'll just go home. And the Bible's after we killed 185,000 of you, but it's just a funny historical versus biblical accounts of it all.
Well, just going back to what we said earlier, that he doesn't say, and the siege will come to nothing. It's you're going to have to go through a difficult time, but there's hope on the other side of it. So just kind of reinforcing that word from God.
Well, the next section is well-timed.
I know, right?
Merry Christmas.
It's here, by the time this releases, it's going to be during finals week.
Yep.
It's as our Christmas break is about to begin.
Yeah.
And we have one of the most famous Christmas prophecies, Old Testament passages pointing to Jesus and his birth. I'll take it away, Ron.
Happy to. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah. Boy, I butchered that.
Who?
I know, right? From you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel. And he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. If the Assyrians come into our land and tread upon our soil, we will raise against them 7 shepherds and 8 rulers. They shall rule the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod with the drawn sword. They shall rescue us from the Assyrians if they come into our land or tread within our border. I kind of feel like I should have left off those last couple of verses because they don't really quite line up.
Yeah, which is interesting.
It is, kind of going back to that earlier conversation.
A little assertion, yeah.
But yeah, this is such a fantastic passage, quoted obviously in the New Testament. Jesus obviously being born in Bethlehem. In fact, this is probably it is a passage that is spoken to the Magi when they come to Jerusalem. They come looking for the child-born king of the Jews. Of course we're going to go to Jerusalem. It's the capital city. And they're like, yeah, we got no baby here, which is really cool because, it really begins to undermine popular notions of power and all that. But they're like, oh, yeah, it's Bethlehem, the city associated with David, but it's a small village, out in the middle of nowhere. But it has this exalted role in God's restoration of his people. And so obviously Matthew quotes this as he's beginning to make the case for Jesus. So fantastic Christmas passage.
Yes, but has an original context, of course. I mean, obviously, this is hearkening back to this idea of as you mentioned, David. Right, we have David who was he was anointed there, and he came from there, and this is the line that God said will be forever. And so you have a people who are perhaps worried that the kingship will fall and the nation will fall. And God assures them that I will raise someone up like David, right? I mean, he doesn't use those words, but that's implied.
Question.
Sure.
So when I think of David and Bethlehem, I think of the book of Ruth,
Also, yes.
right? I mean, obviously Ruth and Boaz. I mean, Naomi, and her family leaves Bethlehem, and they're in Moabite territory for a while, and then they get restored back, and Ruth ends up marrying Boaz, who have kids, and then David, right? In the David narrative, is Bethlehem talked about?
I think he's anointed by Samuel in Bethlehem.
That's where his anointing takes place as well?
I remember as
Okay.
well.
Yeah, that's where I was spacing. For some reason I go back to the book of Ruth, but I'm not going back to other places. So this is associated with David in multiple places. So that's kind of what it would have, we think about Jesus, but they would have thought David.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, all the different prophecies about the restored kingship, especially going back to the covenant with David, when God says that one of your children sit on the throne of Israel forever. Well, you got a long period of time with no Davidic king there. And so God kind of doubles down on that, says, yes, I'm going to actually restore that person. So yeah, when you talk about Bethlehem, people are just going to go, Bethlehem, David, just make that very organic connection.
So the origin from ancient days, that's again David's ancient line.
I would think so.
That's how they would have read it.
Right. Because now we're, 300 years away from David, give or take.
Yeah, the timeline better than I do.
About 300 plus years. So,
So then, so the part of this passage that is un-David-like would maybe be the last line in verse 5. And he shall be the one of peace. Right?
that's fair.
Because David is remembered, David was not allowed, one of the reasons the text gives us that he wasn't allowed to build the temple because he was a man of blood.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the new David will be a man of peace.
Well, yes, obviously that's definitely true. I wonder with all the shepherd imagery that's in here as well, it's more viewing David the shepherd king as opposed to David the nation building king.
The warrior
right?
king.
It's almost like you should read this in light of Psalm 23 instead of in light of 2 Samuel, right? With this idea of that's what they're hoping for, is this, that vision of David as opposed to the one you're definitely talking about. Because there are a lot of these great imageries like that he's going to come and he's going to shepherd this flock in the strength, and it does make me harken back to Psalm 23, it's exactly what God's going to do for us. It's so great.
Yeah.
What makes you think
and the young David who was a shepherd. And
Well, and like in Ezekiel, I can't remember which shepherd it is. In Ezekiel, talking about the shepherds, God bring his word against the shepherds of Israel, and then I will be the one to shepherd Israel and all that. Love that shepherding imagery.
So Matthew then looks at this and says, this is about Jesus. How can this be about David and also be about Jesus?
Oh, right, yeah. It's kind of one of those riddles. But I think that, and this is where you can almost make it a both and. That when it comes to fulfillment, we often think fulfillment is you predict it and then wait for it to happen. But when we think about the word for fulfillment, like the Greek word for fulfillment, it doesn't always mean to fulfill, but rather to fill something up fully. And so you want to, if the glass is partially filled, you want to fill it up to the fullness. And so there are many passages in the book of Matthew that very clearly were referring to Israel, but they found their full filling up in Jesus. It's like, out of Egypt I called my son, Hosea 11:1. Clearly applying to Israel, but they're like, oh man, but when Jesus came along, now we understand it in its fullness. And so I think you could see it through that kind of a lens.
I mean, I've always thought this passage is one of the most literal fulfillment passages because, this is anticipating a future king from David's line right? Who will bring peace to Israel. So it's not about David. I mean, it's about a new David that they're waiting to come from David's line.
The shoot from the stump of Jesse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is awaiting a future David. And I mean, and if this isn't Jesus, then who is the literal referent that's not Jesus?
Well, and there would have been many Jews in the first century who would have said, we're still waiting. The non-believing Jews who reject Jesus as the Son of God, Messiah, and all that, we're still waiting for the fulfillment of that. And that was part of the big conflict between believing and non-believing Jews. Jesus followers are like, Jesus is a fulfillment. And other people are like, no, he's not. So those arguments were continuing in the first, second centuries and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, Micah understood there was going to be a new Davidic figure. He wasn't thinking of Jesus in the first century, obviously,
Right.
But I mean, this Davidic figure. And I think that's why at various times people tried to put the mantle on, right? Or thrust upon them. You got a Zerubbabel, right, in the exilic period. You got other people there's like, hey, is this the guy? And like, no, he's not the guy. And as they go on, and then it comes to Matthew. I mean, it's kind of interesting that Matthew's the only one who talks about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because you're exactly right. Like, if this was what they're waiting for, Matthew's the one who says, like, hey, and that it seems like that's the guy, right? Like,
Right.
Am I getting this wrong?
yeah. And so this is. I mean, I think you're right. This one is a little stronger case of actual. I don't want to say actual. It's not wrong.
I mean, the thing it's talking about
Yeah.
is like all the exile and picking apart of the people of God that happens both in the 8th century and then in the 6th century is going to be made right and straightened out, and God's people will be vindicated from a Davidic ruler who will bring peace for God's people. Doesn't happen until Jesus.
Yeah. This is not just typology. This is
Right.
actual.
Yeah.
Predictive things. So, and I agree. There are a lot of others. You mentioned that out of Egypt I call my son. That's typology for me. That's like this thing happened, and this other thing is like it.
Right.
This is not like it. This is exactly because no one else is that person. Like
Right.
no one else fulfilled this in that time and place.
Well, that's why the genealogy in Matthew's gospel is so important because, Matthew makes it abundantly clear that Jesus is descended from David and Abraham. Like those are the two main characters he says that Jesus is descended from. Because people read this stuff and they're like, yeah, we're waiting. God said it was going to happen. So where is this Davidic king? Where is he going to come from? And Jesus' followers said, we got it. We know who that guy is. It's Jesus.
Yeah. But what we were saying about the fulfillment and the fuller fulfillment, I think Jesus, when we look at this passage, we see a fuller meaning in that, the Davidic figure, the ruler from old, right? They're going back to David's time. We might say from old, like the one through whom creation came into existence
Right.
from old, right? Like we,
Yeah.
The Logos, right?
Yeah, now we're going to John's gospel.
you know what I'm saying?
Open up that can of worms.
And then when they were thinking the one who'll bring peace is like what you were saying, David, like the shepherd kind of peaceful ruler, and we think no, Jesus is the ruler of peace
The Prince of Peace.
in such a bigger way.
Yeah.
Right. And so we would read more into this in light of the fact that Jesus came and fulfills this above and beyond what they would have thought. Right.
Yep.
And so we would see more because we've seen Jesus than they probably would have been thinking when they read this.
Right. But to be clear, many of them are not like that. I
Many
think.
of who?
The quote prophecies about Jesus.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you want one that's the strongest, most direct one,
Yeah.
this is one of the strongest prophecies you'll get about Jesus that he fulfills in a way that's kind of hard to dispute if you have faith.
Right.
Yeah.
If you have eyes to see, right? Oh, you're making a really good point. I appreciate that.
Maybe the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Right. Well, again, Jesus himself said, many will come claiming to be the one. Like he knew that there would be other people who did not buy his claim who are going to say, no, I fulfill the Davidic prophecy. I'm the one who going to lead you in victory. And so, yeah, Bar Kokhba was just another example of that. Probably the biggest one, from that time period. So, yeah, other people tried to make the claim and failed miserably.
And verse 4, and he shall stand and feed his flock, like I am the good shepherd. Like, again, like there's so much about the life of Jesus that this letter really brings about in the most literal way. Of course, I guess the tension there is the now but not yet. Like Jesus came as the Prince of Peace, this hope, and still the Babylons of the world are still standing. So we're not going to get the fullness of this prophecy even until Christ returns. Right. So there's a sense in which it's still unsatisfied. And, it takes our faith to believe the one born in the manger in Bethlehem is the one who fulfills this prophecy.
I think I agree with that. Like, we're not going to see the fulfillment, the complete fulfillment until Jesus comes back and brings the kingdom in its fullness. I think within the confines of Christian congregations, we should look at this and say, when we're gathered together as believers, that this should define the relationships we have within our communities and with our other, churches, with other people who are gathered believers, that's part of the now. The not yet is when every aspect of our lives is universally defined by this. But there should be an element that says, not just at Christmas time, but 24/7, 365, when we gather as believers in these small communities, we should be defined by this, because this is where Jesus is reigning as our God and our King. And so his kingdom should look like this.
Agree.
And with that,
It's that Christmas message right there.
There we go. Man, I guess we should end on that because we're literally out of time.
Love it. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Malachi.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist. Social media is managed by Darren Harris.